There is no two factions in the 40k universe that are as evenly matched as the Space Wolves and the Orks. Both military forces are defiantly resilient to the point of reckless abandonment. The Space Wolves have the notorious sturdy ingenuity and natural military mindset, whereas the Orks have the ubiquitous and biologically embedded thirst for war. Each would much rather charge and engage in brutal hand-to-hand combat than any other form of warfare. And when these two forces meet, the outcome is always slaughter on an unimaginable scale. Each would much rather charge and engage in brutal hand-to-hand combat than any other form of warfare. And when these two forces meet, the outcome is slaughter on an unimaginable scale, where neither side will back down from a proper fight. Such was the case during the Stormclaw incident in the 41st millennium. And with that said, I want to welcome you guys back to another 40 Facts about the 40k universe. I am your host, Gersh1, and today we're going to be talking about Space Wolves versus the Orks as we get into the Stormclaw incident. If you guys are new to the channel, we post Warhammer 40k lore videos every single day. If you guys have suggestions or any questions about the 40k universe and would like us to create a video for you, just comment down in the comment section below. If you enjoy our content, thank our patrons on Patreon. It is because of them that we can do this. Link in the description if you guys want to support us. Don't forget to subscribe. And with all that said, let's get into 40 facts on the Stormclaw incident. The night world of Alaric Prime was caught in the grips of a bloody, sprawling war. The greenskin hordes of the Red Walk, led by Warlord Grok Facerippa, had descended in their billions, embroiling the planet's defenders in a battle for survival. The Orks were opposed by the towering knights of the Alaric nobility and the grim-faced Cadians of the Astra Militarum. Led by heroes such as Castellan Stein and Lord Naru de Gallio, the forces of the Imperium fought tooth and nail for every volcanic island and sulphurous river. The torn bodies of martyred men carpeted the sacred isles, and yet the Orks came on, fighting their way to the very foot of the sacred mountain. However, Warlord Grok was betrayed, the cunning Big Mech Grok orchestrating his leader's messy downfall and seizing the reins of power for himself. And although the Imperial forces didn't know it, Grok was considered dead. The war ground on, with first one side and then the other gaining the upper hand. In the end, however, Grok's ingenuity could never be denied. The tides of battle flowed back to the sacred mountain once again, and the Greenskins finally dropped a frozen asteroid on the horrified Imperial defenders to break them body and soul. And as the Imperial forces faced their darkest hour, help arrived from an unexpected quarter. The skies filled with plummeting attack craft, Greenskin and humans alike staring upward in awe. It was the Adeptus Astartes who had answered the planet's desperate cries for help. The Space Wolves had arrived. Strikeforce Stormclaw was Fenrisian vengeance made manifest. Led by no fewer than three of the chapter's greatest heroes, the Old Wolf and the Young, Logan Grimnar and Ragnar Blackmane, were at the forefront of the attack upon the Sacred Isle. Meanwhile, leading the second wave of Fenrisians into the war, came Wolflord Krom Dragongaze. However, the fell-tempered Dragongaze was less than delighted with the assigned duty. Wolflord Krom was an ambitious individual, and whether or not a slight was intended, he perceived one from Grimnar's choice as a second wave commander. From the observation bay, Krom angrily watched the thrusters of the first wave drop pods dwindling into firefly sparks, slowly crushing a drinking goblet in one hand. Krom would prove to the Old Wolf that it was he, not Ragnar, who should be fighting at the forefront of this war. Soon after, Dragongaze stood in the cockpit of his Thunderhawk gunship, the Vengeful Howl. His fangs bared, he rode the juddering deck like a longship in the storm, as the super-heavy attack craft plunged its way through the Aurican atmosphere. In the ship's hold rode the pick of Krom's great company, while in its wake came a fleet of landers, gunships, and assault boats. As the clouds parted and the Sacred Isle hoved into view, Krom was already running through the deployment protocols and initial attack strategies in his mind. The ships of the second wave bore warriors and tanks enough to crush an army many times their size, and Krom meant to see them do just that. Suddenly, Iron Priest Alvard, his pilot, beckoned Krom to his side. There was another signal, a distress call clawing its way through the Fenrisians' banter. As the Wolflord listened intently, his mouth curled into a feral grin. Ordering his remaining forces to deploy in support of the Old Wolf's attack, Dragongaze turned his Thunderhawk south. As the craft peeled away, the distress call continued to warble through its vox speakers, a Cadian voice pleading for help, repeating a single ominous name. Reinforcement requested to Blister Isle. Xeno threat level Crimson. Repeat, Warlord Grok is here. Brutal and barbaric even by Greenskin standards, Grok was a warlord of unsurpassed ferociousness, who led every fight from the front. With the face ripple act and brainpower, he more than made up for with his force of presence and sheer unstoppable aggression. Grok embodied the principle of might makes right. This massive, claw-wielding beast could shout the loudest, hit the hardest, and wouldn't know how to back down from a fight even if his life depended on it. and now Dragon Gaze had the chance to slay this powerful beast. It's an opportunity he couldn't pass up. The Distress Call spoke of a landmass known as the Blistered Isles. It lies some 50 miles off the southern coast of the Sacred Isles. Its western plains are carpeted in Pharaoh-Creed and looming imperial architecture, housing as they do the planet's administratum offices alongside several sprawling sulfur refineries. To the east, beyond the humpback range of volcanic crags known as the Hollowed Hills, the landscape completely changes to rocky wilderness. Castellanstein's Cadians had prioritized the defense of the western side of the Blistered Isles, seconding several large buildings and further shoring up to create a stronghold designated as Fortress 26. However, for the first week of the conflict, the Blistered Isles had remained completely untouched by war. All of that changed when a ragged flotilla of scrap metal had washed up on the island's northern shore bearing Grok's last loyal lads. Though they had no boys left to speak of, Grok's old skull knobs were the toughest of the tough, and with a seething horde of grots to soak up enemy fire, they were still a force to be reckoned with. They attacked the defenders of the Blistered Isle with furious abandon, tearing the refineries apart and driving the Cadians back behind the armored walls of the Fortress 26. Having fought their way across the island, the Skull Knobs had finally settled upon the Blistered Isle's jutting southern headlands. This towering promontory was overlooked by a slouch-shouldered volcano that the Orks named the Mouth of Gork, a sullen monster of blackened stone and gushing streams of vent that rose from the ocean waves a quarter-mile offshore. The raw might of the volcano had impressed the Knobs so much so that they chose to build the imaginatively named Gothtown in its shadow. Behind triple-layered tangled wire fences, the headland housed the Blistered Isles Genitorum complex, providing the Orks with plenty of ready-made shelter and allowing their mechs to construct a fully operational teleporter pad. Of course, Orks being Orks, the status quo didn't last for long. With the Humi skulking behind their big metal walls, the Skull Knobs started to fight amongst themselves to see who was going to be the next boss. After a string of increasingly violent pit fights, gunfights, and brawls, the mechs, fearing that the Knobs would tear Gothtown to bits, suggested a compromise. They would use the teleporter pad to beam themselves back to the Big Humi Mountain, where Grok was clobbered. There the Knobs would dig for the big boss's Rippy Claw, and whoever got their hands on it first would be the next war boss. The Skull Knobs jumped on this plan. After all, Grok had been the meanest orc any of his followers had ever seen, and whoever took his claw as a trophy would surely inherit that big bad killing power. Perhaps it was mere good fortune that saw the Skull Knobs launch their fateful teleporter mission when they did, or perhaps it was the will of Gork himself. Whatever the truth, the Greenskins appeared on the Sacred Mountain slopes in the direct aftermath of Mogrok's meteorite impact. Veiled by clouds of smoke, their appearance went unnoticed by the shell-shocked remnants of the two warring armies, allowing them to dig for their boss's corpse in peace. However, what they found was more than they bargained for. The Greenskins of Gothtown stood waiting with bated breath as the teleporter flare died down across the returning Knobs. Their excitement turned to amazement as the war boss Grok strode from the pad, scarred and hollow-eyed, but most definitely still alive. Orks are resilient beyond the ability for Imperial science to explain, though the towering monster had been blasted with grenades, scorched with plasma, and a whole battle wagon kicked on top of him. He had clung to whatever sliver of life beneath that wreckage. Had the Imperial forces taken the time to ensure Grox's demise, they might have been able to kill him there once and for all, but the war had swept wildly onward, leaving no time for clearing of wreckage or bodies. Thus Grok had lain undisturbed, his incredible alien physiology seeing him heal just a little bit each day. Finally, as the Knobs dug down through the wreckage that cocooned him, Grox's beady little eyes had snapped open and his killing rage had come to life. Now dropping the knob whose throat he had just ripped open, and flexing the sparking rusted talons of his power claw, Grok swept his furious glare around the Greenskins of Gothtown. For a moment, silence reigned as the Orkoid brain struggled to process this surprising development. And then instantly, the entire throng broke into a wild roar. The boss was back, and soon every luckless Humi on the Blister Isle would know about it. Bellowing for the mechs to bring him a fresh shooter, Grok wasted no time to find out where the enemy was. He snorted his disgust at the tales of the Humi fort, with its big walls and heaps of Daka. Nothing can stand against Grok Face Ripper, and hiding behind a big wall wouldn't help. Even as Krom Dragon Gaze was supervising the final preparations of his attack force, Grok and his tribe were surrounding Fortress 26. The ruins around the Cadian position seethed with greenskins and weird war engines, as Grok prepared to smash the Humi fortress flat. It was this assault on Fortress 26 that got the attention of the Space Wolves. The rushing waves turned to a flickering collage of gray, black, and gold as the vengeful Howl swept over the coast of the Blistered Isle. The Cadian distress signal had become clearer as the Thunderhawk neared the island. Now quite suddenly it cut out amid a final snarl of screams and static, yet it made no difference to the Wolf Lord Krom. The Space Wolves' attack vector was already in lock, red hazard lights strobing through the craft's interior as the warriors on board readied themselves for battle. Over their war cries came the voice of Iron Priest Alvard, announcing 30 seconds to contact. Krom felt his twin hearts thumping with excitement as the ruined cityscape swept below him. What followed would be a fight for the sagas. Engines bellowing, the Thunderhawk swooped low over the blackened carcass of a habstack, and suddenly Fortress 26 came into view dead ahead. Dragon Gaze saw a broad statue-lined plaza crawling with greenskins and a tangle of interlinked buildings, sheathing lasgun fire into the Xeno horde. He had a fleeting glimpse of an armored Orkoid walker smashing its way through the fortress walls, and flames belching from its windows. Then the ruins below flared with a pulsing green light, and the Thunderhawk lurched as if though kicked by a sky giant. Krom was launched from his feet, slamming into the co-pilot's throne as warning hymns filled the cockpit, and the pilot fought with his controls. Vengeful Howl lurched again, dropping so suddenly that Krom was thrown straight up, his head cracking against the ceiling with enough force to kill a lesser man. Krom's vision drowned in darkness, and consciousness was completely swept away. When Krom awoke, he did so to the sneaking suspicions that a Nystro had used his skull as an anvil. The thudding pain pulsed behind his bionic eye, and the harsh tangle of sulfur and acid was thick in the back of his throat. Hauling himself to his feet, the Wolf Lord's face darkened as he took in his surroundings. The late afternoon sun fell upon him through the twisted branches of the acid woods. Sulphurous mist drifted between the trunks of the trees. The fumes rose from the marshy ground to wind sluggishly about the legs of the Wolf Guard, the Grey Hunters, and the Bloodclaws. They stood, patching minor wounds or keeping watch. A long trail of devastation cut through the acid bogs and close-packed woodlands. A deep and blackened trench sizzled with acid-ground water that led to the battered form of the vengeful hand. Shaking the ring from his ear, Krom strode across the equipment-strewed clearing, bellowing for an explanation. This he received from the pack leader of the Wolf Guard, the stern-eyed Bjork Winterfang. Standing firm in the face of the Wolf Lord, the veteran warrior explained that they had been shot down by some kind of strange greenskin field artillery. The enemy gun had projected a powerful force field, intended to snatch the vengeful Howl from the skies, and fling the craft straight into Fortress 26. It was only through the skillful piloting of Alvar that the Space Wolves had escaped alive. As it was, a great section of the Thunderhawk's hull had been torn loose, and its machine spirit stunned into incomprehension. Fighting unresponsive controls, the Iron Priest had kept them in the air long enough to clear the fuming peaks of the Howl Hills. But he had finally lost his battle with gravity as the Thunderhawk plowed nose first into the outskirts of the acid woods. The venerable Iron Priest and his servitors were working to restore their craft to function, but Vengeful Hand had seen better days. The work might take hours, even days to complete. Krom cursed bitterly at this news, for it was a delay he could ill afford. Krom knew the wisest thing to do would be to attempt contact with the main body of Grimnar's force, but the Wolf Lord's pride could not allow that. Bad enough that he had abandoned his command in search for personal glory. If he now called for help from allies that might even now be fully embattled with the real foe, Krom Dragon Gaze and his great company would be a laughingstock. The punishment for failure of such magnitude would surely be severe, and the damage to Krom's reputation irreversible. No, he thought, he would not cry for help like some fool lost in the blizzard. Instead, he would fight for his glory. He would claim Warlord Grok's head in single combat, even if he had to march all the way across Blistered Isle to do so. So resolved, Krom barked a string of orders, swiftly marshalling his men into two forces. The Wolf Lord himself would depart at once, taking with him his loyal Wolf Guard and the hot-headed Bloodclaws. They would return to Fortress 26 on foot, performing a swift night march across the hollowed hills to fall upon Grok's warband from the east. Meanwhile, his Grey Hunters would remain at the crash site, charged with the duty of protecting the Iron Priest while he completed his repairs on the Thunderhawk. As soon as the craft was operational, the two forces would unite once more, and finally kill Warlord Grok once and for all. In the wake of the Wolf Lord's departure, his loyal Grey Hunters settled in to stand watch. Level-headed and dutiful, the veteran Fenrisians walked the perimeter of the crash site as the tech priest labored on, deep in the craft's guts, as the daylight fled and the dense mist rolled in to take its place. Suddenly a flash of green energy lit the mist in the south, and the pungent tang of Orks assaulted the Fenrisian nostrils. Reacting with practiced calm, Pack Leader Iron Axe voxed his packmates, ordering them into a defensive spread around the flank of the Thunderhawk, where they could protect the tech priest at his work. Superhuman senses strained to penetrate the muffling murk of the mist as the Grey Hunters trained their weapons out into the darkness. When the attack came, it did so with sudden fury. One moment Iron Axe's men stood poised like mist-covered statues. The next, the night was alive with running, yelling shapes, and the Grey Hunters' guns were blazing in their fist. Lokrir Coldeye, the squad's plasma gunner, was the first to open fire as his ears caught the sound of scuttling feet. The mist around him glowed like a gas lantern, and his plasma gun howled, spitting blasts of energy into the gloom. As they burst amongst the foe, the plasma rounds illuminated shrieking Gretchens, wielding rusty shivs and lumpy pistols. Lokrir's fire reduced several of the stunted greenskins to ash and sent their comrades fleeing in terror, yet there were dozens more of the diminutive greenskins closing in from all sides. The Grey Hunters blasted away, their weapons roar muffled by the cloying fog. Grots squealed and died in droves, their ruined corpses littered the boggy ground beneath the trees. Iron Axe's warriors quickly adopted the best firing discipline for the numerous foe, unbroken streams of bolt rounds giving the enemy no chance to respond. Frantic return fire whined in towards the Space Wolves, crude slugs sparking off their armor and punching splinters through the tree trunks. Then amid a second blazing flare of energy, Grok faced Ripple and a hand-picked mob of his biggest, meanest skull knobs joined the fight. From the moment the war boss's bestial roar echoed between the trees, Iron Axe knew his men were in trouble. The knobs bowled forward through the Space Wolves' fire, massive reactive bolts glancing from their crude but effective body armor as they closed the gap. One especially ugly brute charged head down into the fray, bullhorn helm smashing a Fenrisian through a tree trunk with a splintered crack. Grok thundered into the Grey Hunters like a battering ram, eyes bulging and jaws agape as he vented weeks of built-up rage on his luckless foe. The massive greenskin swung a titanic overarm blow, hammering old Older into the mud and shattered bone. Iron Axe howled in rage and denial as the old warrior died, leveling the bolter pistol to Grox's head and squeezing his trigger. To his astonishment, one of the skull knobs lunged into the shot's path in a moment of brute selflessness. The whistling bolt blew out the orc's skull in a spray of liquefied brains. But it was cold comfort for Iron Axe, as his true target rampaged on unharmed. Iron Axe had not become a pack leader by squandering the lives of his men, and as more knobs surged from the darkness to join the melee, he realized the Grey Hunters could not win this engagement. Even now the hulking orc war boss was tearing his way through the flanks of the vengeful Howl, roaring his bloodlust as he took his power claw to the defiant Iron Priest. Meanwhile, barely half the Grey Hunters remained on their feet, and they would be no use to Lord Dragongaze's corpses. Snarling a curse that would curl the troll's toes, Iron Axe ordered his surviving men to disengage. Swiftly and brutally, the Grey Hunters blasted and hacked their way to freedom, retreating west into the darkened woodlands on the trail of their wolf lord. Blood-curdling roars and agonizing howls chased them like vengeful ghosts, fading to muffled silence as the Space Wolves melted into the sulphurous gloom, forced to leave their fallen behind. Dawn's cold light found Krom Dragongaze and his warband emerging from a rocky ravine amid the feet of the hollowed hills. They had pressed on through the night without any rest, scaling rocky, steam-venting slopes, picking their way between sizzling acid pools and leaping across black-mold chasms. It was a march that would have left most soldiers exhausted at best, if not maimed or killed by the hazards they had faced. To the Space Marines, such things were but a minor inconvenience, and as the Space Wolves made their way into the blackened ruins of the refinery sector, they remained hard-eyed and eager for battle. In this they would not be disappointed. From the moment Krom's Wolfguard and Bloodclaws entered the urban sprawl, they held their weapons ready for battle. The Bloodclaws led the way, nostrils flaring and ears straining as they stalked through the ruins with half an eye on every shadowed doorway. Krom could see how eager the young warriors were for a fight. Each Bloodclaw was all but shaking with anticipation. Yet to their credit, the fierce youth maintained their discipline, scouting ahead of the massively armored Wolfguard Terminators with a commendable restraint. Perhaps an hour after Krom's force left the hills behind, the Bloodclaw pack leader, Agile Redfist, voxed back word that the Greenskins had been located. It came to no surprise to Krom to hear that Fortress 26 was no more, yet still he felt a flicker of regret that the valiant Cadians had been overrun. This spark of sorrow was swiftly fanned to a fiery need for vengeance as the Bloodclaws reported swarms of the foe still crawling across the fortress's gutted ruins. Crouched amid the tumbled bones of the ecclesiarchal shrine, Redfist's pack had picked out dozens of Gretchens moving amidst the ruins of Fortress 26. Directed in their labor by hulking orc slavers, the scrawny greenskins were pulling the entire site apart piece by piece. Larger shapes moved among the sweeping gangs of loot gatherers, Killikans using their snapping claws and buzzing saws to tear apart the fortress superstructure. Great heaps of loot were being piled onto wheeled carts and makeshift sleds on one edge of the plaza, ready to be dragged away by the cons once the harvest was complete. It seemed that Grok had left his artillery, the very same weapons that had shot down the vengeful Howl, to watch over the salvage operation. Redfist reported that the weird field guns were well dug in amidst the ruins of the western edge of the plaza, their Grok crew appearing to be entirely off their guard, lounging around and yelling mocking encouragements to the toiling working gangs. Closing in through the rubble-covered streets with his Wolfguard at his heel, Krom allowed himself a hungry, lupin grin. The greenskins obviously thought themselves safe. He would make sure they didn't live to regret this mistake. The Terminator armor worn by Krom's Wolfguard was incredibly potent. It provided his followers with all the firepower and survivability of a mainline battle tank, though at the cost of a degree of speed. While the Wolfguard was still trudging through the ruins towards Fortress 26, their Bloodclaw comrades were forced to wait. As he made his way towards the greenskins, Krom was conscious that he still didn't know the exact number or disposition of the foe. He was mindful of the considerable threat posed by the Xeno field guns. Anything that could put a hole through a Thunderhawk would surely make short work of the power armor. Rather than risk his glory-hungry advance guard entering battle prematurely, Dragongaze instead ordered the Bloodclaws to work their way around the foe's flank. They were to take up positions overlooking the Ork artillery, avoiding direct contact with the foe while they did so. Only when Dragongaze and his Wolfguard were poised to strike were the Bloodclaws to launch their assault, using crack grenades to put a swift end to the field guns and blades to butcher the crew. The explosive demise of the Orks' artillery would be Krom's signal to attack, the two squads of space wolves closing like the jaws of a black wolf upon the throat of the foe. By the time the Wolfguard were in position, the sky had filled with heavy ominous banks of clouds, and a flat stillness settled on the air. The daylight had taken on a bruised quality, lending everything a slightly surreal air, while the breeze had flattened and fallen like the last breath of a dying man. Krom sent a single vox pipe to Redfist. His signal answered almost immediately by a rising chorus of howls. The war cry of the Bloodclaws cut through the still air over the clanging and banging of the industrious grots. All across the worksite, red eyes widened and ears flattened back in fear. Seconds later, a series of concussive booms echoed across the plaza. Columns of fire and crackling green lightning shooting skyward as the Ork field guns went up one after the other. Then the real killing began. Barging their way through the ruined wall, the Wolfguard strode into the plaza from the east amid a scatter of brick dust and shattered ferrocrete. Without so much as breaking a stride, each Wolfguard Terminator squeezed his trigger, spraying fire into the grot-infested ruins before them. Immediate chaos ensued, Gretchens dashing in all directions and screaming at the top of their lungs. Krom led his Wolfguard from the front, weapons readying for the slaughter. These slinking servant creatures were no true foe, yet still they were filthy Xenos, light-fingered looters who had aided in the slaughter of good Cadian soldiers. The Space Wolves would make sure that they all die in that place and left to rot. As the Wolfguard's steady advance brought them to the very edge of Fortress 26, the enemy seemed to regain some semblance of order. Amongst the ruins, snaggle-tusked Orks with long, crackling prods were bellowing at the small charges, lashing about themselves to marshal the grots into some kind of battle line. Meanwhile, the Ork walkers had dropped their armload of scrap, and were now advancing with purpose, shears snipping and guns leveled to fire. Rannick, the Wolfguard wielder of the squad's heavy flamer, turned his weapon upon the nearest mob of grots. The flamer's hiss turned to a bellowing roar as it spat a hungry wall of flaming promethium into the enemy's midst. Greenskins squealed as their flesh caught light and ran like tallow. The other Wolfguard kept a drumming squall of firepower, stormbolter rounds punching apart scrawny grots and gnarled old slavers in explosive sprays of blood. Lashed forward by their overseers, more mobs of Gretchen were now scurrying forward through the ruins. Their rusted guns banged and popped as they directed frantic volley of fire at their hulking assailants, yet the bullets pattered off the Terminator armor like hailstone. First one mob of grots, then another was blown to bits and burned alive, slaughtered wholesale as they attempted to make a break for freedom. Then a sudden volley of rockets and shooters fired upon the Wolfguard, blowing Ironjaw from his feet with a lucky hit. The Fenrisians turned to see armored walkers bearing down on them. As the Kilikon finally lurched into the fight, it was Krom who answered them. Howling his fury, the Wolflord charged headlong at the swarm of hissing, clanking walkers with his axe held high. Ducking inside the clumsy swing of a howling saw arm, Krom aimed 3 swift chopping blows at his first assailant's hip. The Kilikon's leg sheared off in a spray of oily fluid, but Krom was already turning, hacking the barrel from a smoking big shooter before slamming a crack grenade through the vision slit of another con. There was a muffled bang, a spray of blood, and the smoking machine keeled slowly over like a fallen tree. The last walker began to back away, trying to turn on the spot and flee from this mad-eyed howling warrior. It didn't get very far. Hefting his axe, Krom hurled the blade end over end through the air, embedding it in the boiler of the fleeing machine with a deadly force. Whistling and venting great gouts of steam, the boiler spilled gallons of searing water into the con's interior, its pilot shrieking for several moments, the horrible sound reaching a crescendo before choking off into silence. Moments later, a frothy, fatty soup began to slop from the walker's rusty seams. Recovering his axe from the waterlogged wreck, Krom glanced up, breathing hard with exertion as he took in the fight around him. His Wolfguard were slaughtering the last of the grots, the Bloodclaws now having charged into the fight from the west to cut off the Xeno escape. Finally, thought Krom, things were starting to go his plan. He might not have his true quarry here, but a good chunk of the greenskin's strength had been eradicated. Only one of his bloodclaws had fallen and a Terminator had been sorely injured, yet these were casualties he could absorb. Better yet, without their field guns, the Orks would have no answer to his repaired Thunderhawk when it arrived. Moments later, however, Iron Axe's pack appeared and the Newsday board turned Krom's grin of victory into a furious scowl of disbelief. The Thunderhawk was no more. Upon learning of his Thunderhawk's destruction, only physical restraints by two of the Wolfguard had prevented the Wolflord from tearing out Iron Axe's throat. Instead, Dragongaze had turned his anger upon the Orks. Hauling the last living slaver from the wreckage of Fortress 26, Krom had begun shattering its bone one at a time with his armored fist. Finally, pointing with one shaking, broken finger, it had given up the location of the Orc stronghold. Satisfied, the Wolflord had torn the slaver's head from his shoulder and drove it onto a spike of scrap before ordering an immediate march. Wolflord Krom would make no attempt at stealth as he marched upon Gothtown. As the Fenrisians had slodged through the ruins towards the southern headlands, the clouds continued to darken above them. Roiling in from the north, massive banks of black clouds and swirling vapors filled the skies. Arcs of blue-white lightning leapt and danced in its depths, charging the air until ghostly corpses crawled across the armor and weapons alike. The Space Wolves muttered that this lightning was an omen, that their fight for vengeance would be fueled by the wrath of the storm. Krom Dragongaze said nothing. In his mind, the storm seemed to reflect his own black and terrible fury. Soon both would vent their full force upon the green-skinned defenders of Gothtown, and then there would be a reckoning. It was 2 hours after dawn when Krom's surviving Space Wolves came into sight of Gothtown, yet the sky had grown so dark that it might as well have been midnight. The battered ramshackle buildings of the Genitorum stood stark against the looming bulk of the offshore volcano, silhouetted by the mountain's fires. Here and there amid the tangles of loot and wire, mobs of savage figures could be seen stamping and waving crude weapons as they readied themselves for war. Over the crack and growls of clouds above, Krom and his followers could hear the roars of Warg rolling down the headlands from the midst of the foe. Finally breaking from his long silence, Krom finally turned to bellow at his warriors, ordering the attack and crying vengeance for his fallen packmates. The Wolflord threw back his head and loosened a howl that was taken up by every man in his command. Up above, the thunder snarled and roared as if though the storm was answering the Fenrisians' wrath, and then even as the first blazing bolts of lightning arced earthward, the Space Wolves charged. The Fenrisians marched up the steep headland, and their greenskin enemies surged forth to meet them. As the waves crashed against the rocks below, and the storm bellowed madly above, the two forces slammed together at the very outskirts of Gothtown. Herded by their larger cousins, the runs cowered and shrieked as the full fury of the lightning storm broke overhead. The small Gretchen fired frantic volleys of shots, a lucky round punching through the eye of a charging Bloodclaw. Moments later, the young warriors' packmates crashed headlong into the Gretchens with a howl of rage. In moments, the grots were reduced to a tangle of bloodied bodies. Meanwhile, Iron Axe's Grey Hunters traded heavy fire with the Killikans as they emerged from between the two Genitorum stacks. Whistling rockets and glowing plasma bolts scorched the air between the two squads. One Grot Walker shuddered with explosions as it crashed backwards. One of the Grey Hunters was reduced to a glowing sludge from the waist down by a searing energy blast. Viciously and desperately, the two forces fought on. It was in the center of the line that the hardest fighting occurred. Here, beneath the looming energy-covered shadows of the teleporter array, Krom Dragongaze led his Wolfguard Terminators against Grok Face Ripper and his Skull Knobs. Flames jetted out from both squads as the distance closed. Blinded, one of the knobs reeled straight into the thunderous punch of a power fist, only for another horned-helmed greenskins to rip the same Wolfguard's arm from his socket and then headbutt him to his knees. Here a rune-etched power blade sliced through greenskin flesh. There a massive, whirling tooth saw churned madly against Terminator armor until spraying sparks between gushing gore. Yet none could match Krom and Grok from sheer ferociousness. Yet none could match the war boss or the Wolflord. Krom screamed for bloodlust as he hurled himself at his despised foe. A bolt of lightning seared down from the clouds, exploding within yards of the combat as Krom's axe struck sparks from Face Ripper's massive claw. As his foe stepped back, Grok roared, swinging an enormous haymaker that could have torn Krom in two had it connected. Instead, the war boss's saw churned through empty air as he overextended himself. Dragongaze seized this chance to howl in victory as he swung his axe up for a killing blow, only for an orange ball of flesh and teeth to knock him down. As a shadow fell over him, Dragongaze rolled frantically, pure instinct carrying him aside as Grok's massive claw pummeled a crater in the Ferrocrete. Grok roared in frustration, the bellow turning to agony as the Wolflord's axe hacked deep into the Orc's ribs. A shocking gout of blood gushed forth, but it was Krom's turn to yell in pain as Grok's forehead hammered into his own, cracking bone and spilling the dazed wolflord to the floor once again. Grok raised his claw for one last blow, a victorious grin stretching across his face. Then suddenly the surviving space wolves were there, howling wildly as they drove the greenskin off. Grok roared with frustration once more as one bolt shell after another slammed into his armored chest, punching him back into the midst of his lance. The Wolfguard, Bloodclaws, and Grey Hunters formed a thin circle around their fallen lord as the Orks prepared to charge once more. The Wolfguard, Bloodclaws, and Grey Hunters formed a thin circle around their fallen lord as the Orks prepared for the last charge. And then with a glare like a false dawn, a bolt of lightning spat from the sky and slammed into the teleporter array. The combatants looked on in alarm as the mech-built contraption began to spark and shudder, emitting an ominous rising whine. Grok roared with anger as one of his mechs, eyes wide with panic, produced a glowing remote control and hammered madly at its buttons. There was a sudden explosion of bright green fire, and when the Ork warlord lowered his arm and blinked the glare from his eyes, the teleporter and all the wolves who had stood in his shadow were simply gone. As the teleporter energy faded, the surviving space wolves looked at each other with superstitious awe. They stood in a deep crater, surrounded by the wrecked remains of the Xeno teleporter. Dragongaze stirred and moaned in confusion as the sky suddenly filled with watery daylight, and his eyes widened as he realized his Vox was being filled with voices, Imperial voices. Winterfang opened a channel and sent an open hail, chuckling at the surprised responses. It seemed that by pure good fortune, the misfiring alien device had delivered Krom Dragongaze and his surviving warriors from the destruction and back into the war. The Wolfguard quickly gathered up their fallen lord, rallying the surviving Fenrisians, and made for friendly lines. Meanwhile, amidst the blackened ruins of Gothtown, Grok raged and smashed as the storm swept away over the horizon. He had lost his enemy, his teleporter, and now his temper. And yet Grok's rage slowed as he realized that there was one more way off this island and back into the war. It was time to go fix up the great big Humy flying machine. And those were 40 facts on the Stormclaw incident. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. This is a more narrative style of video. We'll go back to the 40 facts video probably tomorrow. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed. And if you have any suggestions or questions, just ask down in the comment section below. Thank you guys so much for listening, and I'll talk to you tomorrow. This was Gersh1 with One Mind Syndicate signing out.
Oh, if you could put my freedom